Good day, denizens. So today we start talking about some reactions to this industrial revolution. We've talked about the Enlightenment, we've talked about all the revolutions, but I bet you didn't know that those revolutions were bourgeois revolutions. Must crush capitalism. At least according to the guy you see there, Karl Marx, amongst other peoples that we'll be talking about with these philosophical or intellectual reactions to industrialization. And there you can see good old Karl Marx up there and his writing partner Friedrich Engels. Of course, Marx is going to be eons more popular, and Karl Marx himself, quite frankly, is going to change the course of world history for better or worse. Nonetheless, one of the most influential thinkers of human history. And just to give you an idea here, so for example, what Karl Marx, some of the terms he's going to use, you see some of those terms here that we'll talk about more in depth. But of course he used the term the bourgeoisie to explain the capitalists, the wealthy. As a matter of fact, he was the first to call them capitalists, the rich folk. And then he had the so-called proletariat, and you can see where he gets that term from there at the bottom, Latin term, who were the workers, the working class. And for Karl Marx, it was all about struggle, the struggle to reach equality and for the masses to rise up and basically empower themselves and to have an equalization of society. And that's the thing about Karl Marx. He didn't say, you know, there's a chance of communism happening. He didn't say, you know, it would be nice if we had communism. That's not what he said. He said communism is inevitable, that it's going to happen. So basically what Marx and Engels did was they studied the history of the world's economies. So they take a economic approach to history. And actually, you know, to this day, Karl Marx or Marxism is actually a historical approach as well. Many historians look at world history through the Marxist lens. But specifically what they looked at was, you know, power, industry, and finance. Who controlled these, and how did they control these? Why did they control these? And at what point would they no longer control these things? And they argued that basically societies, all societies, develop in these stages, or more specifically what Marx called modes of production. And you know, really matter was the sole subject of change, not spirit or the metaphysical. Everything was physical for Marx. It was a matter of who controls the tools or the means of production, and that's who holds the power. And for these guys too, there's this constant conflict between opposites, right? Where if the bourgeoisie are in charge, well, there's a class that has to be exploited. So then essentially you have these antagonistic relations, antagonists going against, right? The ones who basically set up a source of conflict between two sides throughout history. And basically, we talked about these modes of production, and this essentially is how Marx viewed history. He said, look, humanity started with this form of primitive communism, which we'll talk about here in a second. We'll talk about all these, actually. Eventually, with primitive communism, at some point, some person or group takes power, and they set up a feudalistic society. And under this feudalistic society, a king holds all the power, and his nobles, you know, serving under him, they're given a little bit of power, holding some land or whatever. And at the bottom, basically, they control all these people, these serfs or these peasants, who they force basically to do labor for the land and property owners. Eventually, as money begins to flow around the globe and people who do not have noble, elite, privileged power gain more profit and gain more literacy, they come to realize their situation, and they form their armies, they form into the masses, and they rise up, and they overthrow the feudalistic system. An example of this would be the French Revolution. And basically this takes us into the capitalist mode of production. And under the capitalist mode of production, which is what Marx would argue we are in right now, under the capitalist mode, what happens is you have these wealthy business owners, these wealthy elites, who control the means of production. They have the tools, they own the machines, and basically the worker, the average person, falls under the sway of this ideology, not realizing that they are being exploited and taken advantage of, until we get to socialism. And under socialism, to make a long story short, essentially people begin to realize their situation, something we call reification, this understanding of something that is or something that is, I guess, not real suddenly becomes real. This understanding of your plight. And this leader, socialistic leader, takes charge, takes over, and leads this revolution against the bourgeoisie. And in this revolution, the bourgeoisie are overthrown. They're taken care of by any means necessary, essentially. And essentially all that's left are the proletariat. And of course this leader. Now, of course, this leader, after so many years, once the stage is set for this kind of communal, egalitarian, equal society, once it's set, humanity just naturally falls into this communist mode of production. And communism is the pinnacle of humanity to Marx. And yes, these are the modes of production. Okay, so just talking about the history of all this. So basically, Marx said, look, here's how humans started. They lived in this kind of primitive state, or a primitive communism. Communism, we're talking communal, community. People living in common, living together and working together to all uphold the common good and maintain life and keep life in the balance. So basically then under this primitive communism, everything is shared, right? No one actually owns anything. No land is owned or anything like that. And remember, this whole idea of land ownership really is more of a European type of idea, that you own the land to exploit the land and make profit. But of course, for example, in Native America prior to Columbus, there were other native groups that, they did see themselves as owning land per se, as controlling land for hunting or whatever. They just didn't have this notion of, okay, we're going to use this land to grow a bunch of crops and sell them on a global market. But eventually, no one owns anything under this primitive communism, but eventually somebody rises up and realizes, you know what, I think I can take all this over. And that's when we go into the feudal mode of production. So we leave primitive communism and we move into this stage of feudalism. And under feudalism, a king or an emperor or a chief, he becomes the ruler over all of the people. And there you can see William the Conqueror to the left. You're being somewhat of an example here. And basically what this king does, he has a lot of land to oversee. So he gives land and privileges to the noble class, who basically rule the people for him. And this begins this antagonistic relationship, as you can kind of see depicted in the picture, right? Where the noble has the control over the people, forces them to work the land, and of course the noble is the one who profits. The people live in fairly dire state of existence. Well, I mean, I imagine it's probably pretty bad, but nonetheless, they do subsist overall, but they are still controlled. Their lives are dominated by this noble class, by lords. So basically, on top of that, the people don't really gain an education, and they're told that, God chose the king to rule, and then the church, of course, helps the king out in this way, because both the church and the king have this kind of uneasy alliance where they can both agree at least we have control of the people. Now, this is all Marx, right? This is all what Marx believed. And essentially what begins to happen, though, is as trade developed, some people get wealthy. And people who are gaining wealth under especially the mercantilist system of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, these people begin to say, hey, wait a second, why am I paying all the taxes? Why do I have no political power when basically I am the one who is the backbone of the economy of my country, right? This is the bourgeoisie. And these wealthy individuals, they have money, but they also have education, and they're becoming professionals. They're becoming lawyers and merchants, educators, owners of companies, right? But they realized that they could make way more profit if they didn't have to have a king in the way. So the revolutions that occur, French Revolution, American Revolution, Haitian Revolution, Latin American revolutions, overthrow these monarchs, and the bourgeoisie take over and lead us into the capitalist mode of production. So this bourgeois revolution, let's talk a little bit more in depth on that. So essentially the wealthy class, they usurp the power or overtake the power of the ruling class, of the king, right? And his nobles. So, the English Revolution, going back 100 years before the French, for example, another example of this revolution by the wealthy overthrowing the king. And the bourgeoisie established this capitalist mode of production, which of course seals its own fate, according to Marx, since it is reliant upon the exploitation of the masses and this kind of competition for resources. So basically then what this bourgeois class does is they try to control all the means of production. They control the tools, right? They own all the machines. They own the factories. And essentially you as a worker, as a laborer, you no longer own your tools. Because, for example, even in the feudalistic mode of production, at least you owned your pitchfork and your shovel. You owned these tools so that you could make something of the land for yourself, right? But under the capitalist mode of production, according to Marx, what happens is even the tools are now owned by the factory owners. And this sets up this antagonistic relationship, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, versus the proletariat. So then the machines, capitalists, the means of production are owned by these capitalists, these bourgeoisie, and they exploit the proletariat for surplus profit. But of course, they also fool the proletariat, right? The proletariat becomes convinced that, well, you know what, with a little bit of hard work, maybe I can rise up to the top too. Or, it's not so bad, I'm making decent money, even though I don't really have complete power, at least I have something, right? And you kind of become deluded. You become part of the machine, because what you don't realize, according to Marx, is that you've been enslaved by wages. The wealthy are telling you what you are worth, and they've taken away your tools. And your tools really were your identity. So your identity is lost. So really the only commodity that the proletariat has, the working class has, is their labor. And this is problematic, right? If you have a surplus, for example, of workers, which is typically the case, wages are not going to be high. So that means that the bourgeois can take even more advantage and more control. So basically then what that means is the worker, he has lost or she has lost their conscious identity, right? The tools that controlled your own labor are now gone. And if you really think about it, how do you tend to identify yourself? When you reach adulthood and you got a full-time job, right? And you're hanging out and, people ask you questions. They want to know who you are, After you tell them your name, they almost always invariably ask, oh, so what do you do? Because what you do tends to be your identity. So what Marx is arguing here is that the bourgeoisie have taken the tools which formed your identity. So then under this capitalist mode of production, then these business owners, the fat cats that you can see up there in the picture, they get richer. Looks kind of like Scrooge McDuck swimming in his money bin or something. While the workers do the hard work for pay that is less than the value of their labor. And the capitalists get more and more power to serve their own interests, but at the same time they're consuming all the natural resources. And for Marx, this was really setting in stone the fall of the capitalists because of their own greed and avarice, sucking up all of these resources. Invariably, resources will run out. And basically what happens is this capitalist mode of production creates this massive working class of people who eventually become angry with the way that they're treated. And it makes sense that Marx would be saying this back, in the 1800s, starting, really with the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Because if you looked around back then, you looked at factories and you saw children laboring in mines. You saw women being paid less than men for the same type of work in a factory setting. You saw the poor living in in the squalor of the cities with disease and crime. So it makes sense that Marx would say these types of things. But that's the thing, is that what happens is eventually these workers slowly begin to realize their situation. They organize into unions and they demand change. And on top of that, overproduction in combination with underconsumption leads to vast unemployment, right? So basically, once so much is produced because of this kind of capitalist greed, right? They're always about produce, produce, produce until prices start to drop and they're like, wait a second, we've produced too much and I'm not making enough profit, so stop producing. Well, sure, that's easy for them, but for the worker, to stop producing means that you no longer are working, and if you're not working, you're not being paid. So what Marx argued was that this will lead to the socialist revolution. But let's talk about this concept of reification as well. So then what Marx was talking about here was something like a base superstructure setup. Let me explain exactly what that means. So basically, these kind of concepts like you see here, the state or national pride, religion, Marx, for example, called religion the, quote, opiate of the masses. This idea of exceptionalism, that, hey, our country is better than all the others because we have some type of origin that is, chosen by divine powers, or even capitalism itself. What these bourgeoisie running these places do, these capitalists, is they create this, right? Now, they might do this consciously or unconsciously, right? But none of this is real, is what Marx would say, right? So the base would be, for example, just the economic foundations of a society, right? But then the superstructure is all the stuff that's built up on that base, right? So in other words, this kind of materialism that's set up, things like conspicuous consumption, owning things, that this comes to define who you are as opposed to who you actually are, right? But all of these kind of work as quote unquote weapons of mass distraction so that the bourgeoisie can continue to exploit the masses. And like I said, it's not that the bourgeoisie are necessarily doing this on purpose, it's just this organic occurrence. So basically, the proletariat is no longer conscious of the false reality in which they live, where the bourgeoisie own the means of production, and basically the proletariat, they just blindly follow the will of the bourgeoisie or the will of the capitalists. And basically, what Marx said was this capitalist mode of production, it's not going to go away until the proletariat becomes conscious of its exploited situation. This reification, this understanding that, wait a second, what is fake has become real, but what is real we are not witnessing and we are not embracing. So once the workers come to realize their situation and the reality of their situation, and notice that things like national pride, nationalism, that all these things are created, that they're artificial, that is when the workers will finally realize their state and rise up and reclaim their tools and thus their identity, according to Karl. So then basically we get this socialist revolution, and this socialist revolution is assembled by typically one group or even one key leader. For example, with the Russian Revolution in 1917, the guy you see to the left there, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or his revolutionary name, Vladimir Lenin. And basically, in the socialist revolution, all the rulers, the kings, the churches, the capitalists, they are all eliminated, according to Marx, when this socialist revolution occurs. The workers take control of the country, and basically they start to produce things for everyone. And because nothing is made for profit, all people begin to benefit from education, health, and technology. And these ideas then spread across the world to create communism. So what exactly is this communism? Well, you had a lot of critics, and perhaps rightfully so at the time, who told Marx, oh, you're just being a utopian. In other words, you're imagining this kind of perfect world where there are no problems. And this drove Marx crazy. He said, this is not utopianism. As a matter of fact, Marx said, this is inevitable. This is what is going to happen. So basically what Marx said was, the remaining capitalists, they're going to put up a fight because they control the militaries and things like this. They control the politics and the governments. They control the machines. But in the end, the will of the people, as more and more people realize their situation, that they will overtake this capitalist mode. And basically, because everyone now works together, there's no need for things like war. If there's no need for war, there's no need for armies. If everybody's sharing and everything is equal, we don't need police. As a matter of fact, we don't even need a government. Everything is provided by the people through, and this is another thing a lot of people forget about Marx, through this advancement in technology. In order for this to happen, basically technology advances to the point where things are essentially being taken care of for us, so that humans themselves really don't have to struggle. Everything is just shared, and because everything is shared, there's no such thing as money. All these things disappear, so humans can basically spend their time doing what they want to do, playing guitar all day, playing Xbox or something, I guess. I don't think Marx envisioned Xbox. And all human activity goes toward benefiting each other, right? Allowing all people to live their lives to the fullest. There is no state, in other words, state government. Nothing is holding the people back from doing what they want to do. So what do you think? Is this possible? Could this happen? Is this inevitable? That's what Marx said. Is it? Why or why not? And what exactly would a communist society look like? How would it work? Have we ever actually seen a communist government? Or wait, is that an oxymoronic question? Answering those questions and more as we go forth. Ponder that.